In video games, there are plenty of examples of things that just miss the mark. There are also plenty of examples of game series that stand the test of time but ultimately fall off the face of the planet. On this channel, I have covered many of these games in the past, and I've also had a lot of fun uncovering the history of some of our most beloved franchises, and how they've ungracefully fallen into the depths of obscurity. Today, we will be talking about yet another forgotten RPG franchise. One that, up until recently, was revered by JRPG enthusiasts across the world. We are talking about none other than the PlayStation Classic exclusive, Wild Arms. Wild Arms was among an abundance of other JRPGs released on the PS1, but it always stood out to me because of its emphasis on guns. Yeah, I mean, we all love guns in some capacity, but Wild Arms just did it with a twist. The arms became a main emphasis of the story, politics, and environments players would interact with throughout their journey. I loved blasting my way through enemies, littering the turn-based goodness at every turn. But as many of the most die-hard Wild Arms fans have pointed out, the series has all but fizzled out. In a world where atypical games are starting to stand out, the lack of a new Wild Arms game has confounded me. Although the last release was as recent as 2018, the series has felt rather stagnant for way longer than that. So join me, as we always do, in hopes of figuring out what really happened to Wild Arms. In the early 90s, innovation was at the height of everything. CD-ROMs were starting to infiltrate gaming at an alarming pace, and consoles such as the Sony PlayStation were coming into their own. One of the companies that Sony first partnered with in the early days of the PS1 was MediaVision. MediaVision was founded in 1993 by former members of Riot, a subsidiary of Telenet Japan, responsible for developing the Tenchi no Uta series for the PC Engine. Their job was to create games that would be graphically impressive and innovative for Sony, something that was extremely important for their new console. The company developed first-person shooter games with some role-playing elements, crime crackers, and rapid reload. The games were fun enough, but Sony wanted more. They wanted to capitalize on the growing popularity of role-playing games and get the American audiences involved. To do this, MediaVision pitched the idea for a role-playing game with modern elements such as guns, as well as a full 3D battle sequence to help it stand out. Sony was pleased with the pitch, and development for the title Wild Arms had begun. Wild Arms takes place on the planet called Filgaia, a world that is inhabited by humans and other elf-like creatures called elves, Crimson Nobles, and Baskars. Long ago, a war between humans and another race called the Metal Demons had taken place, and although the humans eventually prevailed, it certainly affected the rest of the world. The leader of the Metal Demons, Mother, became locked away forever, and eventually the negative memories faded away. Well, almost entirely. Many became scared of weapons called arms, which were utilized by the Metal Demon race. In the first title, the player takes control of Rudy Rough-Knight, a boy who possesses the same mysterious power of arms, leading him to be feared by some and eventually becoming a pariah of unfortunate circumstances. Wild Arms has a Western-type vibe to the entire game. The landscapes have a lot of red rocks and mountainous terrain, the music contains some striking guitars and the occasional whistling, and focus on more antiquated firearms, all related back to the Old West. I've always found this style intriguing because it's a unique and refreshing departure from some other fantasy JRPGs I've played in the past. Funding and support for Wild Arms was heavy. MediaVision and Sony both wanted to create a game that blew people away. Part of doing this involved a departure from 2D turn-based combat into full 3D graphics, one of the first for its time. In addition, the game's intro cutscene was actually developed by Studio Madhouse, responsible for some memorable 90s and 2000s anime like Trigun and Death Note. When the original Wild Arms released in Japan in December of 1996, it became an instant hit among traditional RPG fans. Many hailed it for being similar to behemoths like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, while producing many of its own innovations. In addition, the music was praised by almost all that had listened to it. I mean, it's got a spectacular spaghetti western feel to it that it strikes your soul. Some of the early complaints about the game were its graphics, which, although impressive, portrayed the characters in short, blocky forms. Though some of this was a necessary evil based on the limitations and evolution of 3D, it was kind of hard to get past for some gamers, and to play it now, it can be a little painful. Ironically, Wild Arms released on the same year as Final Fantasy VII, one of the greatest RPGs of all time, being both good and bad for the game. It did help it sell some additional copies that it probably wouldn't have otherwise, but it often got overshadowed by one of the greatest RPGs ever. Wild Arms was successful enough to get ports in North America and Europe in 1997 and 1998. Since the American branch of Sony Computer Entertainment only had recently lifted its policy against allowing RPGs to be released in the US, there were relatively few RPGs available for the system in the US at the time. So this kind of gave Wild Arms an added advantage in that market. It arguably kind of made Wild Arms more popular in the US than it was in Japan. Well, that and its focus on weaponry. For the second game, MediaVision was overseen by Contrail, a PS1 production company. With the success of the first game under their belt, the studio was focused on adding more sci-fi elements into the game, and due to the success of other RPGs on the console, ended up having about 3 years to work on it. Unfortunately, Wild Arms 2 ended up garnering significantly less attention than its predecessor, once again being overshadowed by other JRPGs released around the same time, including one of my favorites of all time, Vagrant Story. Wild Arms 2 certainly had some innovations, including one of the best RPG stories on the PS1, but not everything was loved by the gamers that played it. In fact, one of the biggest complaints of the game was the departure from the previous main characters, despite taking place in the same universe. Another issue that plagued Wild Arms 2 in North America was the word-for-word translation. A lot of the context and emotion became lost, thus leaving some of the best story-driven moments of the game falling flat. Despite many hardcore fans of the series loving Wild Arms 2, critics absolutely roasted it, leaving some to avoid the game almost entirely. Coincident with the release of Wild Arms 2, Sony signed off on an anime series for the game, something rare for the industry to do in the 90s. Entitled Wild Arms Twilight Venom, the series didn't exactly follow the events of the first two games, but appeared to try and capitalize off recent successes such as Trigun, with its steampunk-esque imagery and atmosphere. Produced by Studio B, the company responsible for the Dot Hack anime, Twilight Venom was average at best. It certainly has not aged well, and I'd do your best to avoid the English translation, which seems to be incredibly hit and miss during these years of anime.
It is one creepy looking tunnel.
Kinda reminds me of your sister for some reason.
Wild Arms even had a manga series released between the second and third games. Wild Arms Flower Thieves is a 187-page manga which was published by Kodansha. It contained elements from the first two games, and if you are a fan of the series, I think it's worth a read for the lore alone. With the PlayStation 2 on the horizon, Wild Arms 3's development had almost begun immediately. At this point, Wild Arms was kind of becoming Final Fantasy 2.0 because of the consistency that Sony and MediaVision were pumping out the titles. For the third installment, a graphical departure was in the mix, and the game relies heavily on those nostalgic, cel-shaded graphics that I thought really meshed well with the game's environments. Wild Arms 3 is my personal favorite in the series because it was actually the first one that I beat. And being pretty poor when I was growing up, this game had a lot of extra content to go through at the end. Wild Arms 3 is one of the longest RPGs I've ever played, which boded well for some Japanese gamers, but some of the American audiences had a sour taste in their mouths about it, which is funny because now it seems like we complain about games being too short. Although the major publications reviewed it favorably, many of the die-hard fans thought the game took a step back when compared to the first two. This leads many regarding it as one of the worst in the series, which is really unfortunate because I think it had a lot to offer that people just didn't give it a chance. The PS2 also saw the release of other Wild Arms games in rather rapid succession. Wild Arms Ultra Code F was a fully remade version of the original Wild Arms game, equipped with new graphics and even some additional items that helped the game age rather well. In my opinion, this is still the definitive way to play the original game, because I personally can't stand those PS1 graphics. Wild Arms 4 and 5 followed in the next few years, but didn't sell extremely well. It was evident that love for the series remained, but the audience was not expanded quickly enough, and it was starting to dwindle. Although Wild Arms 4 and 5 are not bad games by any means, many of the original fans had moved on to other series, or grew out of video games in general. With the evolution of video games came a situation where Wild Arms wasn't really desired anymore. But the series wasn't necessarily done just yet. As with many other RPG franchises, Sony shifted gears with Wild Arms, releasing the next title on the PSP of all things. Entitled Wild Arms XF, the game was a departure from the traditional RPG elements, focusing on tactics more than anything else. Taking place in the same universe as the previous games, XF was a pretty cool game, incorporating dungeon crawling elements with the strategy of something like Final Fantasy Tactics or Tactics Ogre. I remember picking this up from GameStop by chance and actually enjoying it quite a bit. Unfortunately, the game was not particularly praised critically, earning mostly average reviews at the time of its release. Other random mobile games that weren't released outside of Japan existed, and some had RPG elements, some with puzzle elements, but within a short amount of time, these all but fizzled out as well. As the 7th generation of consoles lingered on, Wild Arms was nowhere to be found. Other RPG franchises continued to see at least some amount of love from Sony, but Wild Arms was not one of them. This left many to speculate whether or not the series would get some kind of a reboot. Heck, I was even yearning for another remake if I could get one. Wild Arms had a unique aesthetic style that I really enjoyed, and I felt like the graphical capability of the PS3 and 360 would have really done well for the series. But absolute silence from Mediavision and Sony. Eventually, in 2018, a Japanese exclusive entitled Wild Arms Million Memories was released, and lasted for a few years before shutting down for good in 2020. It has been 13 years since we saw a mainline Wild Arms game in the US. 13 years. With the continued love for nostalgia, surely Mediavision would take a chance with something in a similar vein for Wild Arms? Unfortunately, no. There's been literally zero public mention of a new Wild Arms game since the PSP. Sure, there have been several instances of the Wild Arms games being released digitally on PSN, but nothing new to speak about. Obviously, this leads fans of the series to speculate as to why the series has never seen another game. With a franchise equally as popular in the US as it is in Japan, surely there would be an audience for it, right? Let's take a look at the facts. After the release of Wild Arms 5, there was no question that the game had not sold well. Some people could see this as shovelware, so if the series ever did see a resurgence, I think a rebranding would be in order. Also, the sales of Million Memories did not live up to expectations. Would Sony really risk another release just to lackluster sales and a negative profit? Wild Arms was simply not a blockbuster game anymore. Another item to consider is what games Mediavision has been assigned to over the last 10 years or so. In 2010, they created a new RPG series, Chaos Rings, and in 2011, they took over production of Valkyria Chronicles, which, although is more of a tactical RPG, shares some similarities to Wild Arms. With the success of Valkyria Chronicles, would Sony even consider the need to revisit Wild Arms? What would be the real point of it other than roping in a few older fans for nostalgia purposes? Even with the obvious looking back at us Wild Arms fans' faces, not all hope should be lost. In fact, the more recent successes of games like the Final Fantasy Remake and Persona 5 should really give people more hope than anything else. Should Sony really consider revisiting the Wild Arms series due to the significant rise in popularity for JRPGs? The pandemic has only increased the interest in single-player games, and with few other options for traditional RPGs in existence, maybe the PS5 would be a perfect time for a revisit. To add to this, there is some fuel to add to the rumor fire. This Reddit post from about a year ago mentions that Sony is looking to release a new exclusive, which some hopeful fans are expecting to be an RPG. Also, some others confirmed that Mediavision was actually working on a new Wild Arms game for PS4, which is presumably now shifted to the PS5. But maybe this could just end up being one of those "my uncle who works at Nintendo" moments, just simply vaporware. The reality of the situation is, there has been zero communication of a new Wild Arms game. No official press release, no official statements, no new trademark filing records, no screenshots, and certainly no gameplay footage. Is Wild Arms 6 a pipe dream that will never come to fruition? Are we, as Wild Arms fans, doomed to sit and stew about what could have been? What are your thoughts about the state of Wild Arms? Do you think MediaVision and Sony will ever release another game? Or will they rebrand it to a different name and release it that way? Will we ever see the franchise again? Did I miss some blatant evidence that's out there in the abyss? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Wild Arms is one of my favorite RPG franchises of all time, but like many of these games, poor sales do not equal more titles. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised we got as many games as we did, considering some games like Golden Sun sold much better, but still went stagnant. If we ever see a new Wild Arms game, you can mark me down as being one of the first to pick it up. I just enjoy the series that much.